Okay. We can do this again. Sure we can. Hi everyone! Kate here, back for round 2 of my wartime beverage experiments. Now last week I made 3 different beverage recipes from a 1918 magazine, one of which was an oat mock coffee. The instructions on this were definitely a little vague, but I recreated it to the best of my abilities in the way that made the most sense to me at the time. I used raw steel-cut oats, as the recipe didn't say to cook them first, and in my experience, usually recipes from this time period, if they are intended to be made with cooked oatmeal, do specify that it is meant to be cooked before making whatever the thing is. I had assumed that the oats were meant to be sort of roasted like coffee beans, in a similar manner to making oat cakes, making a little raw oat cake, roasting it until quite dark. However, I think we can all agree that the results from this method were not the best. Okay. Oh, I'm still recovering from that. After posting this video, there were some interesting discussions down in the comments section about whether the oats perhaps should have been pre-cooked, even though the recipe did not specify. I think it was Vintage Life suggested that perhaps pre-cooking the oatmeal would have caused the starches to release, and that would have led to better caramelization, making this a very rich, nutty sort of beverage. Now, the original recipe was a reader-submitted recipe to the magazine. It was not written by like a professional recipe writer in any sort of form. It was written by a Mrs. Ford, and Mrs. Ford does not write good recipes. No offense. There's definitely a lot of information missing in this recipe about how big the oat cake should be, how many to make, how much water, like the proportion of water to oats when you're actually brewing the coffee. She really doesn't include a lot of information, so the fact that maybe the oats should have been pre-cooked and she just didn't specify made a lot of sense to me. Maybe this is just a poorly written recipe that's missing a few important details. So, this week we are remaking mock oat coffee. Oh goody! Yay! Now, before remaking this recipe, I did check a few cookbooks from this era to see if I could find a similar recipe, to see if that had more details, or perhaps a few steps that Mrs. Ford had left out. However, I couldn't find anything exactly like this. It doesn't appear to have been a very common beverage. The other 2 recipes I tried, I suspect it was in a Ladies' Home Journal. I can't quite remember where I saw them, but I have seen those before. This mock coffee oat thing is not something that I was able to find anywhere else. I'm not saying it was never published anywhere else, it's just not easily found and therefore likely wasn't particularly common, which I totally understand. I don't know why anybody would do this to themselves. I should probably also mention that I have like a pretty strong stomach for gross things. I can't have gluten, so I've had a lot of questionable things over the years in it, like mock breads and things, so I'm not exactly a picky eater, but that oat coffee was rough. So without any further ado, let's get started. This time, I'm starting by boiling 1/4 cup of steel-cut oats with 3/4 cup of water. Cook the oats until thickened, which takes approximately 10 minutes. Let the oats cool to room temperature, And then on a baking tray lined with parchment paper, press the oats into cakes. The original recipe had said to add extra water to the oatmeal to make it easier to shape, but I found it formed cakes quite well without the extra liquid, so this time I just omitted that step. Bake them in a 300-degree oven until dark brown in color. This takes quite a long time. These things brown very, very slowly. And as I had to stand in the kitchen watching them anyways, I thought I might as well make some Wartime Oat muffins while I was here. This wasn't really planned, I just got bored waiting, so oat muffins. This recipe is also from 1918 and comes from the Economical Wartime Cookbook. That's right, we're doing a proper cookbook recipe this time. Just a note, what you see me making is actually only half the recipe. I'm going to be giving the amounts for the full recipe, which makes about a dozen muffins, but I just made a half batch to try it. So if my cup of flour doesn't quite look like a full cup, it's because it's not, it's half. Start by mixing 1 cup of oat flour with 1 teaspoon of salt, 1 1/3 of a cup of milk, and 1 tablespoon of melted fat. I used melted butter for mine, but you could use any oil or fat of your choosing. Coconut oil, vegetable oil, shortening, any sort of oil or fat's going to work for this. If you're not a vegetarian, something like lard or bacon grease would have been a historically appropriate choice. I went with butter. I like butter. The recipe next says to use an egg beater to mix until full of bubbles. I do have a set of antique mixers, but I suspect they aren't exactly food safe anymore, so I just used a whisk. Once the mixture is well combined and bubbly, add another cup of oat flour, sifted together with 5 teaspoons of baking powder. After beating together well, let the batter stand for 3 to 4 minutes to thicken. Then, pour into a greased muffin tin. Bake at 400 degrees for about 20 minutes. Now, back to the oat coffee. It was taking ages to cook in the toaster oven. I had done them in the toaster oven because they're a lot easier to keep an eye on, and because this recipe doesn't give any sort of indication of how long this is supposed to take, I wanted to make sure they weren't going to burn. However, the toaster oven is a lot less efficient than a full oven, and after about an hour and a half, I was getting pretty tired of standing there watching them, so I put them in the oven instead. And I left them there. I think in total, they probably cooked about 2.5 hours. They still didn't get very brown. I don't know if it's one of these things that if you had a wood stove that was cooking all day anyways, you could slide them in there and 5 or 6 hours later, they'd be done. But in terms of doing them in an oven, it takes a long, long time. So I gave up after about 2.5 hours. Okay, now is the time where I actually have to try these. Yeah, we're gonna start with the oat coffee, because I've already had one of the oat muffins, and it's good. So let's start with the awful thing. I learned from last time though, and I've put a spoonful of maple syrup in here, so I'm learning. Okay. Oh yeah, that's the smell I remember. Yep. Let's try some of this. Again, I've done it in a French press for convenience sake. Okay. You know, with the maple syrup, that's not bad. Yeah, that's actually drinkable with the maple syrup in there. It's not good, but it's edible. It's consumable. So I wonder if that was the problem last time. I just didn't sweeten it. You just have to sweeten it to the point where you can't taste what the beverage is. Because that definitely smells like last time. Okay, I'm going to try a bit right out of here if I can do that without pouring it all over myself. Nobody else is sharing this, so hygiene-wise this doesn't matter. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's the stuff. I mean, it smells and it tastes pretty similar to the last batch. I may have gotten them slightly less dark than last time, so it's a little lighter tasting. Let's try this again with the maple syrup. Yeah, that's the problem. I didn't sweeten it. I don't normally sweeten coffee, so I omitted any sort of sweetener last time, but that maple syrup really helps. Okay, so it turns out the secret to oat coffee, it doesn't matter so much whether you pre-cook the oats or just use them raw. What matters is if you put a lot of sugar in it. That is the secret to a consumable beverage. I think the maple syrup is a particularly good choice. That would have been a historically accurate choice because there were sugar shortages, but there weren't the same shortages with things like maple syrup and honey. Those were considered patriotic alternatives to sugar. Partly because they could be made domestically. They didn't have to be imported. Well, I don't know about maple syrup. Maple syrup in Canada, anyway, could be made locally. It didn't have to be imported rather than, like, sugar from sugarcane, so... yeah. Sugar. That's the answer. Okay, so we're gonna try the little oat biscuit now. Isn't it cute? I put it on a little vintage plate. Not entirely sure this plate's still food safe, but I'm sure it'll be fine. Now, spoiler alert, I've already had several of these, so I know they're okay. They're not a sweet muffin, they're more like an English muffin. They're fairly bland. So I put jam on this one. I think it would be a good base recipe too if you wanted to add spices to it. I really want to try this recipe adding some curry powder and cheese. I think that would make a really good sort of biscuit. But anyway. That is really good with the jam. I had the other ones plain, but some sort of jam or, as I said before, additional flavoring really elevates these. They probably would have originally been served with jam. Jam was a big deal back then. Especially in the winter when you didn't have a lot of fresh fruits. You would have had preserves quite often. The only thing to note about these is I can't have gluten, so I'm quite used to the texture of gluten-free things, but this is definitely not the kind of thing that would fool somebody that's used to eating real muffins. You can tell that it is made with oat flour and not regular flour. It has a slightly denser texture and a slightly gummier texture. If you think of oatmeal kind of has a thickness there, and you can definitely taste that in these muffins. You would probably know they were made with oat flour. You wouldn't think, oh, wow, that's gluten-free? I would have never known. No, you're gonna know. But they're not bad. Excuse me a minute. All done. I definitely have plans on making a full batch of those oat biscuits. I really like them. Thinking about trying curry powder and cheese, and then maybe a sweet version. I don't know if they'd be a bit like scones if they had cinnamon and raisins in them. I might try that sometime. They're very simple though, and they're easy to make, and I like simple, easy to make recipes, so. That one gets a thumbs up. Oat coffee. I made it consumable, but I don't know that I quite succeeded in making it enjoyable. I don't know that this recipe was ever going to be good. Speaking of mock coffee, I did also have some comments down below wondering about why they would have been making mock coffee in the first place, because in Britain anyway, coffee was not rationed during the First World War. Now, I don't have a well-researched exact answer to this, but I do have a few thoughts. The first thought is that coffee had to be imported. Coffee is not grown in Britain. Now, during wartime, this is a lot more difficult, so there may not have been rationing, but there may have been shortages. It would have been harder to get coffee, and it might have been considered more patriotic to drink something homegrown, like something made from oats could have been something produced in Britain rather than have to import it from overseas. It may also have been like a price factor. The price of coffee may have gone up. I didn't find any supporting evidence one way or another about that. That's purely guesswork on my part. The other possibility is the fact that many pre-war mock coffee recipes, and there were quite a few, people did drink mock coffee before the war, but many of these recipes were made with wheat, and wheat was being rationed. So this may have been an attempt to get a mock coffee-like beverage, like they used to enjoy previously, but made from something other than wheat. It may also have just been a health thing. As Mrs. Ford says, this is supposed to be more wholesome than coffee, so people may have just been drinking it trying to be healthy. It may not have been a shortage thing at all, it may just have been a personal preference thing. Although why you would prefer that stuff, I don't understand. I don't get it. Maybe if it's really, really roasted. Now, I couldn't get it as roasted as it's supposed to be. Maybe it's better, but somehow I don't think getting it stronger is gonna make it better. Maybe it's just my palate. I have a pretty good palate when it comes to historical recipes. I'm usually fine with them, but maybe I'm the problem. Somehow I doubt it. Well, that's it for this week's retry of the mock coffee recipe and little bonus oat muffin recipe. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye! This video is made possible through the generous support of my Patreon members. Thank you. Last week I tried three! Last week I tried 3 different recipes from a 1918 magazine. Yeah, magazine. Can't really see with this hair swoop thing. I don't know if I'm sitting crooked, or the tripod's crooked, or the floor is crooked. Something is crooked. Probably me. So those that preferred to drink mock coffee rather than... Oh, I'm out of battery. Ah, oh, my tripod! It's shrinking! Ah. Okay.